Heavenly Father, we thank and praise you that you have blessed and kept us in your word. And Lord, as we study the monumental task of upholding your word in times of antagonism and struggle, help us, Lord, to remain faithful and true to you, like Daniel, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, to boldly confess that we trust in you and in your Son. We pray. Amen. All right, so we are doing Nebuchadnezzar's golden image, the fiery furnace, as we look at chapter 3 of Daniel, and we've been waiting with great anticipation for this chapter. First, though, any questions about the first two chapters? Remember, the whole story of narrative is a continuous, the whole story of Daniel is a continuous narrative. The themes we see get repeated and put forward in different ways in each chapter, okay? And so we ended chapter 2 with the mention of who? Who was the main characters that were mentioned at the very end of chapter 2? Do you remember?
Nebuchadnezzar?
No. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? Nebuchadnezzar put Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as basically governors or satraps or whatever term you want to use. They're in charge of parts of the Babylonian provinces. Okay? We don't know what parts they are, but that's important for our understanding as we get into this. Because these various provinces are now going to be commanded, or these various provinces' leaders are going to be commanded to assemble. Which means Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego join in this assembly. Okay? All right. So we're going to read the whole thing in its entirety, and then we're going to slow down and look at each section and the words and things like that. But to start off with, Daniel chapter 3, verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the precepts, and the governors, and the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the satraps, the precepts, the prefects, the governor, and the governors, counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. You've already caught part of the narrative, by the way. This repetition is intentional. This repetition is intentionally satirical, I would even argue. Okay? I think Daniel's making fun of this. Okay?
That's great.
Okay?
Right.
I was on verse 3, right? The image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every other kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace. Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to the king, Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, the lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image, and whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning, fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image?" Whoa. I lost my whole sheet. The old golden image that... Oh my goodness, I'm just bumping into everything now. That I have set up. Now if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?
Whoops.
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated, and he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." He answered and said, "But I see 4 men, unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. Then the satraps, the precepts, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants, who trusted in him, and set aside the king's command, and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins. For there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. That's a lot, I know, and I went through it pretty fast too. But part of it is, what are your thoughts? What are the flow? What is the narrative telling you from its whole perspective? What are you getting from this?
It's still not Nebuchadnezzar's God. It's the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and
True. It's still not Nebuchadnezzar's God.
Yet.
Yeah.
But he was totally against God to start with. By the end of the chapter, he was turned.
Your God is pretty cool.
He was warming up.
Yeah.
He's pretty mighty.
Yeah. He's very mighty. Yeah, mighty to save and rescue. Yeah.
You had to worship the one he said to start, and now you worship the other, which is the one true God.
Trust the Lord and leave the consequences to him.
Trust the Lord and leave the consequences to him. Yeah. What was their confession, right? It doesn't, if he saves us, so be it. If he doesn't save us, so be it. It doesn't change what we are to do. His command tells us to do this. Thou shalt not worship other gods. This is what we're doing. Yeah.
But see, I like this. There is no other God. In other words, there's still other gods.
Yeah. We're working on it.
We're working on it.
Yeah, Daniel's got several more years to work on it, right? Yeah.
It just goes to show how Nebuchadnezzar just swings two extremes. You set this up, or this is going to happen. They didn't do it. They said they would do it. All 7 times hotter than before.
Uh-huh.
They survived, and then anyone who doesn't worship their gods can be torn limb from limb.
Well, not worship their gods, but show respect.
If you don't do what he says, you're gonna be torn limb from limb, and your house is gonna be destroyed. There's no little anything between King Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah, and we've seen this in Nebuchadnezzar already. Remember the previous chapter?
He's gonna kill all of them.
Counselors, if you can't tell me my dream and its interpretation, you're a goner, right?
Not just them.
He's
All
eccentric.
of them.
Yeah, not just them, all of them. Yeah, what was that?
I said he's eccentric.
Eccentric. Yeah, he is, and this whole furious rage. I'm kind of getting a little bit ahead of myself, but notice in here on verse 22, because the king's order was urgent. And the furnace overheated, the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach. In other words, those men probably wouldn't have died if they weren't scared for their own lives to try to obey the king as fast as possible.
Yeah.
Because they would have taken precautions. They wouldn't have just rushed up there. They would have protected themselves. Instead, because the king's command was urgent and the fire overheated, they're like, oh no. And they end up dying because of it. Yeah.
My question is probably trivial, but I've always wondered why did they have such a big furnace? They weren't doing central heating or anything. So
No, so
and it had to be huge.
yeah. So this is debated whether this was a brick kiln or potentially a smelting furnace.
Okay.
Back then, both were made in a very similar fashion, where you had this overhead kind of chimney stack and an underside where you would both feed fuel in and take, the smelted ores and things out. And so, from the sounds of it, since they dropped them into it, what happened was they probably dropped them in through that opening on top, but then Nebuchadnezzar was watching through the kind of opening on bottom.
And they were walking.
And that's how they probably walked out as well. Yeah. And so it was a pretty standard setup. The problem is it doesn't tell us, exactly what this furnace was used for, but it is very possible it was an existing smelting or brick kiln or something like that.
But it wasn't for idol worship or stuff.
No, it very, very little about it talks about in the sense of this was an idol
Not like Baal where they...
No, not Baal. I'm thinking of the Moloch. Yes, Moloch. The one that was like this kind of metal statue that you'd put a baby in its stomach and then roast the baby.
Red hot.
Yeah, it was. It doesn't sound like it was that. This is something a little different. Yeah.
I was just reading about this. In this area of those countries, there are copper deposits, and there's evidence that they mined and smelted copper. And you know that they did that because, for example, one of the idols they made was made out of cast gold and fired brick and
Oh, yeah,
that.
yeah.
So there was some mineral business going on, and I think that furnace was for smelting the copper ore.
Exactly. Yeah.
And they built them up against the side of a hill and the way the wind would blow. all that
Or
other stuff.
knowing that they just had this ginormous golden statue, it could have been a gold smelter.
Yeah.
It might have been the very furnace that they made this idol out of, which I would find blessedly ironic for God to use that furnace to whether that's true or not, I can't tell you by biblical standard, but I would find that wonderful if that was the case, Yeah.
I've always thought, ironic also, is that Saddam Hussein said he was the 20th century.
Oh, yeah.
Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah.
Then you didn't read the rest of the story. So.
What's interesting is that Nebuchadnezzar recognized the Son of God as the fourth one. I wonder how he came to that conclusion so suddenly. That's really interesting.
Well, and we'll talk about that more here in a minute. But overall, in terms of the large picture, any other things? All right, let's dive down into some details, and we'll get to your son of the gods. By the way, is what he says.
Okay,
Yeah.
Son of God.
Okay, so already in verse 1, we've got people that have issues. Okay? All the critical scholars, they look at this and they're like, an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and whose breadth was 6 cubits. And they all already start off with several things. One, there's not that much gold in all of Babylon they could have made a statue that big. Keep in mind, it never says it was solid gold.
Okay.
Okay? Many, many times in the Bible, especially when talking about the altar, the tabernacle, and the stuff inside the tabernacle, it talked about the process of overlaying things with gold. But then it just calls them the golden lampstand, the golden this, the golden that. It doesn't mean it's solid gold. It's not specific. It could be overlaid, or it could be solid. Highly, highly likely this is an overlaid statue of ginormous proportions.
Really soft metal anyway, so wouldn't a statue that big made of metal that soft be a problem?
Sorry, my watch thinks it's helping me by finding things that I didn't ask it to find. Yeah, so has anyone here seen gold leaf in modern day overlays? I know you have.
In Denver, the dome is covered in gold.
Yeah, so gold leaf by modern standards is so thin that if you were to take a piece of gold leaf and drop it, it actually drops and floats better than a piece of paper. I mean, I don't know exactly, but I would assume that it's actually thinner than a piece of paper. Can you back me up on this, Dave?
It's very thin. In fact, I'm told, I haven't seen this, I'm told that you can beat it out so fine that you can see through it. Not perfectly, but you can see a blurry image or something through it.
Yeah.
It can be very, very fine, and it's very ductile. It never really work hardens and gets crinkly or anything.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the tin foil that old-fashioned bubble gum comes in. Really thin tin foil, really, really thin.
Yeah.
And you can actually take that and smear it onto something different, and it's kind of cool. And the gold leaf is like that thin.
Yeah.
Very, very thin.
And so the Church of Hope's parents and their family, actually also the church we were married in, they had the ceiling collapse, and it was 150-year-old sanctuary, something like that. And when the ceiling collapsed, thankfully no one was in there, but they did in fact clean it all up and redo the ceiling and all this other stuff. The church had, when they did it, had gold foiled accents in various places throughout their sanctuary. The original. And so for the new one, they put those in again.
Hand painted.
So it's not painted. Those were actual gold.
Yeah.
You paint the glue on, and then you just basically they push this on. And so the pastor was like demonstrating this stuff to the congregation at a Bible study one time. He's like, "Look at this stuff," because he had like this just small little foil that they hadn't cleaned up yet. And he's like, it's incredibly thin. We don't know exactly how this statue was, but the point is, just because you think this statue is solid gold should not in and of itself invalidate the entire book of Daniel, which is exactly what some people try to do with this statement. Okay? The next one is its dimensions. 6 cubits and 6D by 6. Okay? Depending on how you measure the cubit, because your cubit is supposed to be from the tips of your fingers to here, okay? On average, that's about 18 inches, but it can be more, it can be less. Some kings made it bigger because their reign was bigger. Some kings made it a little more standardized. And so that means this statue was anywhere from, I lost my note.
9 feet high, 9 feet.
Anywhere from 87.5 feet tall to 101 feet tall, or anywhere from, and then the dimensions around, 8.75 feet wide, or 10 feet wide. So let's just assume something real simple, somewhere in the middle, 9 feet wide, 90 feet tall. Is that your standard dimensions of a human?
No.
No? Is it your standard dimensions of most idols? Probably not, right? You know, most idols typically are humanoid, at least at this time. Or they were wider, typically, not tall and skinny, okay? The reason I bring this up is because this has led to all sorts of other arguments about, well, that was the statue, but this statue was a statue of Nebuchadnezzar, and so it would have had to be humanoid, and so you would have had to have a base there to have the dimensions right, or other things like that. Again, why do you have to try to read something in the text that isn't there? It never says the statues of Nebuchadnezzar.
Right.
It just says it's some sort of god that Nebuchadnezzar, you know, has told people to bow down to. Whether that is in fact an image of himself or not isn't stated, okay? Most people now would actually say this is probably a national god that Nebuchadnezzar required people to pledge allegiance to as a sign of pledging allegiance to himself. So it could represent a god and still benefit himself to people to worship this. The other part here is he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Okay. No one knows what the plain of Dura is. In fact, we don't even think that's necessarily a plain. The word Dura just means something fortified. And so was this a plain where there was a fortress? Or, as one of the commentators I read said, is this the city wall surrounding Babylon? I like the city wall idea because think about how difficult it'd be for this statue to stand upright if it's this skinny and this tall.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
What if you had it set in a niche of the wall of the city? The city wall, according to archaeologists, says that it was... I didn't put that down here. I have to get over here. The city wall was something along the lines of 200s of feet tall and thick and things like that. Let me get to that point.
Well, think about a totem pole.
Tall and skinny.
They're
and it
tall
has
and
images.
skinny.
Yeah.
It has images on it. And
But
it's
100 feet tall? Have you seen a totem pole 100 feet tall?
made out of totem.
10-story building?
Sure. They're made out of pine trees. It's not that
And
far out
then
of
Washington's monument is tall and skinny.
Oh, which?
So the city wall of Babylon is thought to have been 295 feet high and 79 feet thick.
How many walls have you seen that are 295 feet high?
I'm just quoting from what the scholars have here.
Maybe there was some exaggeration involved.
Well, typically when you do something like this, you're basing it around some sort of architectural, discovery. I don't know specifically because he doesn't reference where he's getting that number from. He just says, since the city wall of Babylon is thought to have been about 200, blah, blah. I think it's a fascinating idea, especially since there's this ambiguity of this whole word Dura, this plain of Dura. I think that it's more likely that it wasn't actually a freestanding statue out in the plain, but it was actually a statue set into the wall of Babylon, of the city of Babylon itself. I think that makes more sense because it also makes sense in the province of Babylon. Well, if you've already got a plain, then why would you need to come over to the city? Okay? So I think that makes more sense. I can't prove that. No one can prove it because no one's actually found said golden statue. But I think that makes more sense just based off of the language and based off of the known history of that area. So.
And the whole story, that doesn't make...
It wouldn't impact the story, other than what it would do is if this statue is in fact set in the wall, then what does that mean? That means all these governors and satraps and precepts and blah 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 had to come to Babylon and basically bow down in front of the city, this highly fortified city. So I think it makes sense in the narrative context as well for that reason. We'll talk more in a second. Regardless, does this invalidate the story or anything? No. Even if it is freestanding, is it possible to build one of these things freestanding? Yes. I would argue it is difficult, but it is possible. Yeah. Okay? All right. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather all these people. Okay? The words you are seeing, satraps, prefects, governors, counselors, treasurers, justices, please don't ever try to get an argument over these words, because they are our best scholarly guess. No one knows exactly what each of these different positions actually did. Because here's a complication. Again, Daniel used the Persian terms, not the Babylonian terms. And the Persian Empire, once it died, all of its legal terms for all of its governors and prefects and all these other people also went away. Okay? The thing that we can gather from this, though, is these people don't appear to be the people that are part of the Babylonian governance structure. They're part of its territorial governance structure. Does that make sense?
What's the difference?
The difference would be king's court versus all the ambassadors and governors. Okay?
Okay.
Who's in the king's court?
Shadrach, Meshach?
No.
No.
Daniel, remember? It said in the previous chapter, Daniel stayed at the court of the king, whereas Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were put in charge of parts of the province of Babylon. Okay? I would argue that's why Daniel's not mentioned in this story. Because Daniel's not part of the people who's been commanded to bow down in front of this image. I think that this command is for, in fact, these outlying people. And we've got a historical example that backs that up, too. Okay? In 594, Nebuchadnezzar sends out to collect, in December of 595 to January of 594, according to a little, basically, clay tablet type thing that they found in Babylon, it says Nebuchadnezzar suppressed a revolt in Babylon. And then after suppressing that revolt, he then went out to all his provinces and collected tribute from them. So around March to April of 594. Okay? After that, he marches with his army, gets all that stuff, and then in 594 to 593, December to January, it also mentions in the Bible that Zedekiah travels to Babylon. Who's Zedekiah? Anyone remember?
He's the king of Jews.
He's the king at Jerusalem. Okay? Already been conquered, but now Zedekiah has to go to Babylon. And this is recorded in Jeremiah 51. Okay? Because Jeremiah sends a letter to Zedekiah while he's in Babylon, saying, hey, basically stop screwing up, right? Okay? Now, if this is in fact the case, and this does line up, and the dates line up, this would have, this whole little thing would have probably followed very, very closely on the heels of Daniel's interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, okay? Within a couple years, if all these dates line up. What would that mean then? Why would Zedekiah have been commanded to come to Babylon?
Bow down.
Exactly. Because not only did he squash this revolt in Babylon itself, in the city, but then he goes out with his army and he gathers up all these governors and satraps and precepts and all these other people, and he brings them to his seat of power, and he has them bow down before his God of power, or so he thought. Yeah, exactly. So the historical setting here flows so beautifully wonderful that I feel like these two biblical stories are very much interlinked and backed up by archaeology. Can anyone prove this definitively? No. Please, every time I draw these comparisons and things, keep in mind I'm doing it by combining all sorts of different stuff into one. Within the narrative, it never actually says Zedekiah was there, okay? So we can't definitively say that. but to me it makes a lot of sense, okay? Any comments on that? Am I going too far? Am I branching out too much?
No. It's
Okay.
interesting.
All right, so if in fact Zedekiah was there, then I find it very interesting that Zedekiah didn't join in with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and not bowing down.
Was Zedekiah a puppet king established by Nebuchadnezzar, who maybe wasn't particularly...
He's a puppet king who, after coming back, ends up revolting and then gets Jerusalem destroyed.
Oh, he's not a good king. He was not going to save
Yeah,
himself.
and so Jerusalem, I didn't write that date down, but Jerusalem ends up getting destroyed shortly after this. So apparently this whole pay homage to Nebuchadnezzar didn't impress Zedekiah enough to not revolt, if this is in fact what happened, right? Because he does in fact revolt, and this is by biblical record, he revolts within a couple years after coming back from Babylon for this whole little thing that Jeremiah records him going to Babylon for. Yeah. Okay. Jeremiah is a prophet in Jerusalem at this same time as Daniel, by the way. Okay. All right. So we already mentioned all this duplicate list of all these things. I love how he put it here in this commentary. Through the repetition satire of portraying all the other provincial officials as flat, colorless, mindless characters who have no individual religious loyalty but blindly follow the pagan religion of their king, Daniel sets up a powerful contrast to the uncompromising loyalty of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to the one true God. Okay? I think he's very intentionally being just ridiculous in his list and all these other things to demonstrate that these guys are like automatons. You know, they're just doing things without even thinking. They're just going forward, going through the motions. Who cares? This is just what we do. In contrast to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who stand up for what they believe in and are rewarded in the end for what they believe in, right? Okay. Final question on this first thing, and this is going to be a theme throughout. Notice I've highlighted in kind of orangish yellow the he set up, had set up, they stood up, had stood up, you know, all these different things, okay? Who's doing this? Who causes the golden image to get set up? Nebuchadnezzar, okay? Write that down, right? Because you need that knowledge to think about how Daniel's using these words, okay? And then this word fall down, okay? You must fall down. This is not just stumbling. This is a word that has inherent meaning with worship.
Yeah.
This is a fall down in worship word, okay?
Yeah.
The same word, by the way, that's used to describe what Nebuchadnezzar did to Daniel at the end of the previous chapter, okay? Mm-hmm. All right. Keep that in mind. There's going to be more as we come up through these things. Notice all the who sets up, Nebuchadnezzar set up this little statue. This was by man. This is just a statue with no life, with no power. It had to even have someone else set it up. Okay? All right. Actually, one other thing on that. So all these setups and these fall downs and everything. One thing in between here, the other thing, this other list, this horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe. Okay. Again, this is the best guess of a lot of these words. The bagpipe word is the one that's the most contested. Okay?
Okay.
So do not put in your mind a standard modern bagpipe. It is not that. We know at least that much. It was not that, because that instrument would not have been known to this part of the world. However, the word they use is very similar to a Greek word that talked about some sort of bagged instrument. Okay? It's similar enough that most people have kind of used this as its translation, but it's not exactly the same. And so the one of the commentators I read said that it's actually more likely, he thinks, that this was not a bagpipe, but it was some sort of drum or percussion instrument, which makes sense more with the list because you're going from horn, pipe, lyre, or I guess lyre's not a, you basically go from woodwind type instruments to stringed instruments to percussion. Okay, because why would you have a wind instrument after you've already listed your wind instruments, is his argument. But again, no one can prove this. Right. The only thing you can draw from this is that they did in fact have some Greek influenced words during the time that Daniel wrote this, which commentators and critical scholars used to always say, that means that this couldn't have been written back in the 600s. This would have had to been written in the 100s. See, Daniel's all false. It's just a story. Except, they used to say that, I said. Modern archaeology has found many, many repetitions of Greek musical instruments over in Babylon, even up into 900 years before Christ. Okay? So, again, commentators, they try to throw roadblocks, and God just keeps tossing them away.
While we're here, what is a trigon?
Trigon, I think, was if I remember correctly, was a type of kind of triangular shaped instrument that you would strum.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if it was like a guitar or more like a harp, but
The Greeks had one like that.
yeah. Several of these are Greek in nature, which is why they keep going to that bagpipe for that final one, because that one also has hints of Greekness to it. It's just not quite the same. Yeah.
Well, he includes every kind of music too.
Exactly. Yeah.
Include everything.
Yeah. So again, these are very technical terms for very precise and specific instruments that scholars just have to do their best guess at. Okay? We just honestly don't know. We don't know what these relate to or what they would have looked like because we don't have pictures of all these things. Here's what Google says for a trigon.
Triangle like guitar.
Yeah.
But you know, when it's talking about whenever you hear this music, you fall down and you worship. So, and they were all brought to that place, wherever that place actually was, for that purpose. Was this a one-time deal? Or were they supposed to, if it didn't apply to the city dwellers, only to the territorial governors, etc., then it must have been a one-time deal because they weren't going to stay there.
Yeah, and it never specifies in here if this is an ongoing thing or if this is a one-time thing. It has this hint of, because this is such a large gathering, that this is a one-time thing. But again, does the text inherently say that? No. But I think the historical context would support that, is what I would go off of. Again, because I think this meshes incredibly well with the Babylonian record of bringing all these people in to basically say, hey, I'm your king, and you better bow down to me, or else my massive army here that's already underneath me is going to come and do something to you. According to that same little Babylonian thing, he killed a significant portion of his army in Babylon before taking the loyal remainder out to go do all this stuff. Yeah.
Right.
So yes, I think this is very much a power move. Of look at me, you'd better get in line. Yeah. Okay?
Just to show that.
All right, so I think that was it for those. Okay, so now we're on verse 15. Okay, and to help with this, let's pull up Matthew 27, 39 through 43. Okay, so pull up Matthew 27, 39 through 43. Okay, and just keep your finger on that. He's talking to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Okay, now if you're ready, when you hear the sound of all these instruments, okay, you better fall down and worship the image that I have made. Well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who deliver you out of my hands? In other words, hey, your God wasn't even able to save you from your own stinking city. Who's the God that's going to deliver you out of my hands now? Is basically what he's saying. Okay? All right. Who is this God? Who is this God?
Our God.
Our God, yeah. Okay. Look what happens in Matthew's gospel and several of the other gospels, actually. Okay? Someone read that. 39 through 43.
Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "You who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross if you are the Son of God." And in the same way, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders mocked him. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he wants him. For he said, 'I am the Son of God.'"
Okay. What do you see ironically similar between these two statements?
They're taunting God.
The parallels.
Yeah, they're parallels. They're taunting God here. They're basically saying, who is this God? And what does God deliver through both of their statements?
Delivers his people.
Yeah, he very much shows deliverance. In other words, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they go down to that fiery furnace, and who is the God who delivers them? This fourth person. Okay?
Yeah.
Jesus goes to the cross. Who is the God that delivers him? Well, depending on which text you're taking it from, Jesus himself or God the Father, because they kind of give each other credit for this deliverance. Okay? And what do they also both do? They both go to the executioner's block as a result of their beliefs. Jesus would not rescind the fact that he is the Son of Man, the Son of God. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would not rescind the fact that God is God and the statue is not. Right? Okay? So that's, when you look at the irony of these statements, it's just, it's one of those like, oh, I know the answer to your question, King Nebuchadnezzar, because it's coming up. It's coming up, right? Nebuchadnezzar ends up answering his own question, right? No other God who is able to rescue, right? Mm-hmm. Who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? Why, he is the God who is able to rescue like no other God. Okay, Nebuchadnezzar answers his own question. If this be so, verse 17, if this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. Okay? This is another one of those ones where it's a really difficult phrase to translate. And our English Bibles tend to try to make it sound a little bit nicer. Okay? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego aren't saying, if this be so. They're saying, if our God whom we serve exists, he will save us. He is able to deliver us. Okay? They're not saying that they doubt the existence of their God. They're saying that, hey, even from your perspective, Nebuchadnezzar, who you're not quite sure from God, or from any other third-party unbeliever's perspective, if this is in fact what we believe in, then why would you expect anything different from us? If this is in fact what we believe, if our God does in fact exist, then why would you expect us to be scared? Why would you expect us to do anything different? If this is truly what we believe, then that's the next logical step for us to do, is to actually fulfill our belief through our actions. Okay? So if this be so, our God whom we serve is able. Yes, but it's more along the lines of, if he exists, then of course we're going to go to the furnace. We're not going to do this. This is exactly what we believe. Okay? Why'd you expect anything different out of us? Okay? Notice, too, it doesn't say anything is obligated on God's part.
Yeah.
They're saying that, yeah, he can do it. We don't know if he will or he won't, but he can do it. Okay?
It's like, thy will be done, in other words.
Exactly. Yeah. Thy will be done. Yeah. And he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Okay? In other words, we're not like some idiot advisor that you've pulled from other provinces that just believe whatever the winds are saying. No, we actually believe this. We actually hold this to be the truth of reality, and we're going to follow through with it. Doesn't matter what you say or do. This is our whole heartfelt belief. Yeah. Okay? Any questions?
Well, Abraham wasn't the only one that had real, true, pure faith.
Oh yeah, no. There's many people in the Old Testament that are held up as examples of faith. I mean, even someone like David is held up as an example of faith, despite the fact that he had his multitude of sins as well. Okay? Yeah.
And we can esteem them as our brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
Because
Exactly.
they're believers.
Yeah, and if you go to the Hall of Heroes in the book of Hebrew, remember how, all these people did all these amazing things?
Yeah.
Well, the saved from the den of lions and escaped from fire are two things he lists, just boom, 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 and those two things are right next to each other. Where do you think he's getting them from? These are part of your Hall of Heroes, yeah. Okay? I'm going to jump all the way down. We've already talked about the 7 times thing. They didn't have like some sort of measuring device where they're like, okay, this is 100 degrees here. No, we're going to make it 700 degrees. No. Okay, guys, this is an example of using numbers and specific numbers as symbolism. In other words, this is extremely hot. Okay,
right.
Complete amount of hotness, because 7 is often the number used for completeness. Okay, it doesn't mean they measured it and they had like exactly 100 degrees. No, 700 degrees. Or no, don't try to take things literal that don't have to be literal. Leave things that are supposed to be literal for that. And he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Here's one where the literal thing actually makes it more fun. He hired the elite of his army, not just the mighty men, the epitome of army men, because he actually uses the same word. He uses his army men of his army. Okay?
Our Navy SEALs or...
Yeah, like this is not like your Joe Schmo, G.I. Joe. This is like the elite of my army, the big, strong men that I have full faith can tie these knots beyond a shadow of doubt and not have any trouble with these young upstart people. Okay, that's the men. Okay, the mighty men.
It just goes more to he goes overkill on everything.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Unfortunately for those mighty men, this wasn't going to be the ideal career advancement for them.
But they were witnessed. They have a chance to believe. They don't have very long.
They had a chance, yeah. And then I love in verse 21, okay, he goes through another list. Their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and other garments. Again, we don't know what each of these words mean, but we do know enough to know that there's some sort of clothing that they would have been wearing that would have been a known item to the people back then, okay?
Do you know what month?
We don't know. The best one that I have is probably late December of 594 to January of 593.
So they would be buckled up.
Yeah, I mean you're a lot closer to the equator here, I think.
Why do you include
Yeah.
that in there?
Kenya is
Yeah.
up above
Because
I guess you're right, yeah.
incendiary clothing.
Yeah. The point is, though, not the types of clothing, but notice the fact that they emphasize their wearing clothes. A couple of reasons for this. One, they're in a hurry. They're not going to bother taking the clothes off before they bind them up. And two, have anyone here ever been camping?
Yeah.
Do your clothes smell like they've
Yeah.
come out of the laundry after going camping?
No,
No. What do they smell like when you go camping?
Smoky Joe's Cafe.
Exactly. Your clothes absorb the scent of smoke like no one's business, don't they?
They do.
Imagine not having any man-made materials in your clothes and then getting put into a fiery furnace. You're going to be smelling like smoke to high heaven, right? But what does it specifically record for us? That God did their laundry for them.
Yeah.
Right? Their clothes didn't even smell like smoke. There wasn't even a scent of smoke on them. That's how much God protected them, that even the smoke couldn't infringe upon the honor of his servants.
Wow. That's pretty
They should have gone up in flames immediately.
Yeah.
They're still there. Sweet smelling.
Yeah. I mean, none of these. I mean, perhaps like some forms of polyester might not gather it as much, but they're not using stuff like that back then. Yeah. Okay? So I love the fact that Daniel includes even that little tidbit. By the way, they're wearing all these clothes, people, and they didn't even smell like smoke. Yeah. Okay. All right, here's a fun one too. Verse 23. And these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. They are falling as an act of worship. This is not just stumbling and tripping. This is the exact same word as all those other times that we were talking about falling down to worship. Okay? This is not just a different type of fall. They are falling as an act of worship. Except instead of to the God that Nebuchadnezzar set up, who are they falling down as an act of worship to? The true God. Yeah, the mighty God. Exactly. Okay?
They could have fought him off and had a big fight there, but they didn't.
No.
Well, they were bound, so
Yeah.
couldn't fight him off.
Okay? After they fall as an act of worship, who rises up? Who gets set up?
Well, Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah. Nebuchadnezzar rises up. This is, again, the same word that was used to talk about how Nebuchadnezzar set up the statue. Okay? Nebuchadnezzar sets up the statue, and all these automatons fall down. God's true servants fall down, and Nebuchadnezzar stands up. Okay? The same words, but different movers. Okay? God's the one causing Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to fall down in worship. God's the one causing Nebuchadnezzar to stand up or to rise up. Okay?
Interesting.
Yeah, these are words. And the funny thing about this, these words are they are so frequent in this narrative, and they're scattered occasionally throughout the rest of Daniel, but they are very dense in this specific narrative and nowhere else in the Bible. Partly because this is written in Aramaic, which most of the Bible isn't written in Aramaic. But the point is, even within the book of Daniel, these verbs are denser together here than any other point. Daniel's not just throwing these together for no reason. He's, again, trying to draw the parallel. He's trying to demonstrate, hey, look at the difference. Look at the distinction. Okay? And so I guess I got a little ahead of myself. Look at the use of standing, in other words, set up, etc., and falling down or fell throughout this story. How does this contrast the Jews with the Babylonians? So kind of what we just talked about, right? That when God is the reason for falling down in worship, that then man and people rise up or step up or set up. But when man is the cause for people falling down in worship, and man is the cause for idols to be set up. It's not the same, right? Yeah. So in verse 27, that's the whole hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. Again, compare that with verse 21. Okay? Finally, what is the intended message of this narrative for Daniel's audience of Jews and possibly the Persians, since, keep in mind, Daniel wrote this in a language that a lot of those Persians at his time would have understood. Okay, what's the message? What's the moral of the story here? Especially verses 29 and 30 and 15 to 18. Compare those verses. What's the moral of the story here?
The first commandment.
Exactly. The first commandment, you shall have no other gods. What does this mean? We should fear, love, and trust in God above all things, right? Okay? Specifically, what does Nebuchadnezzar highlight at the end of verse 28?
That they wouldn't worship any God except their own God.
Yeah? And how did they do that?
Yielded up their bodies.
They set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies. Two things. Set aside doesn't necessarily mean that they disobeyed it. The set aside here actually means they changed the king's command. Okay? They changed the king's command and yielded up their bodies. Okay? Key things here. What does this tell us is our responsibility when suddenly there's no longer a gray area that we can work in, like chapters 1 and 2. Remember, chapters 1 and 2, there's these gray areas, and Daniel was the wonderfully politically correct gray area walker, right? Well, you know, if I kind of just look at it this way, or if I go to this lower official, you know, suddenly there's no longer a gray area. And what has God called us to do?
To change the law.
Yeah. To set aside, change the law, and to suffer the consequences of that law.
Yeah.
To yield up our bodies. Okay?
A lot of Christians have been having to do that now. It's kind of sad.
Yeah. Luther was the same way. Luther constantly, if there was a dictator or someone who was wrongly doing things, Luther would say, if you can't move, if you can't change something, if you can't do something, then you do exactly what Daniel or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did here. You yield up your body. You take whatever punishment has been laid out, and you pray that God uses that punishment as a martyrdom to lead others to Him. Yeah. So that's how does this contrast with the message from Daniel 1 and 2? No longer is there a gray area. We're in black and white. You're either worshiping a false god or you're worshiping the true God. Yeah. Any final comments or questions? I know we ran a little bit long.
So, unless I missed it, a little discussion on what the Son of the Gods.
Oh my goodness, yes, we did miss a big one.
Was it Jesus? Or
Yeah, so pretty much from the entire history of the church fathers, even Jesus himself has this implication that this is him. This is a pre-incarnate form of him. Jesus isn't ever explicit, but Jesus uses Daniel to illustrate himself several times, okay? Nebuchadnezzar, as a Gentile, as a non-believer, doesn't have any frame of reference to identify this as the Messiah, right?
No.
All he can say is there's something different about this guy. He looks like a son of the gods, okay? there are many alternate not translations, but there are alternate text for this phrase that actually does put it as Son of God, singular, and things like that. The problem is those all, when you look at the textual, history, those all tend to be later changes. Someone's trying to oh no, we don't want Nebuchadnezzar to look like he's supporting multiple gods. Of course he would have been supporting multiple gods. He was a pagan. He was a Babylonian heathen king. Why would you expect him to say something different? Yeah, he doesn't have the frame of reference, doesn't have the worldview to understand what he's seeing. And yet through this and through upcoming encounters in the next chapter, he's going to start thinking about this God in particular differently than all other gods. Yeah. Okay? Even here, again, he says, servants of the Most High God, reusing a phrase that he kind of already come up to the conclusion of when Daniel interpreted his dream, right? Your God's the most powerful God. Your God's the revealer of mysteries. But then he adds to this, again, your God's the God who's able to rescue like no other God. Yeah.
But it's not personal to him.
It's still not personal yet. Yeah.
I didn't think of this till just now, but he could have done like in the Transfiguration, not just because of the fire, but he was, something made him really different there. Plus they do say he's only one son.
Yeah. So it's a fourth, and even counts them 1, 2, 3. Wait, why is there a fourth guy? And then he also throws in the double bonus miracle of, and they're not even bound up anymore. To me, that's not a miracle, because you just threw them into fire, and ropes tend to burn. So I don't know, maybe he didn't use something that's flammable for his ropes.
Yeah, but his clothes didn't.
Yeah, the clothes.
Yeah, I know, but which made it a miracle. But from Nebuchadnezzar's perspective, seeing someone unbound shouldn't surprise you in the midst of a fire.
Yeah.
It did surprise him in that the fourth person appeared different.
Yep.
Yeah.
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were just as hot as that new guy. And they were just as shiny, and they were just as everything due to the fire, but the new guy looked different.
That's right.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And then he even identifies it as not son of a god, but then later on when he's talking about them,
He says the word angel.
yeah, where is it? What chapter? What verse is that?
Yeah, I was wondering where you got the word angel from.
Verse 28.
Yeah. Who sent his angel?
Oh yeah, who sent his angel and delivered his servants. Okay, the word angel here is akin to the Hebrew version for melech. Okay, this is the messenger term. Sometimes melech is divine, sometimes melech is not divine. Sometimes melech is the melech of Yahweh, and we call that the pre-incarnate Christ.
Yeah.
Okay, that's when it talks about in the Old Testament the angel of the Lord. That's the melech of Yahweh. Okay.
Okay.
Can't do that same thing here, right? Because again, Nebuchadnezzar is the one speaking. He would have no frame of reference. He wouldn't know to say, "Oh, this must be him."
But he knew it was different.
But he knew it was different, and there's all these other little things there, and so there's almost no one that tries to interpret this as anyone but Jesus.
Yep.
Other than people who just blatantly say this entire thing is a fable and has no bearing on history or reality whatsoever. So those people don't label this as Jesus, but every other commentator, to the point of, as I said, people have started trying to edit the text itself to make it sound even more like that. I mean, there's that convinced of it. Yeah.
There are so many verses that say that God will be with you, and God is a refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble, and tons of them. But it's not just the words, and will you have faith. This was that he was present with them.
Yeah.
And about worst kind of
And did they know that? No. As they blatantly stated themselves, he might save us, he might not. That's not for us to say. Regardless.
Hebrews 11 comes to
We're
mind.
not going to bow down.
Exactly. We know our clear command. We know our first commandment. the rest is not up to us. The rest is up to God. And for us, has God given you a promise that you can walk through fire?
No.
No. But he has promised to deliver you from everlasting fire.
Yep.
And that you can take to the bank. Okay? Yeah.
And we don't know if he was a comfort just being there, because that can be good enough, but he may have spoken things to them, and we don't know.
Yeah. No, it's not recorded for us. Yeah.
Okay.
Kind of like the Mount of Transfiguration. Perhaps Jesus said something to him and said, but you can't tell anyone. At least he gave the disciples the disclaimer until the Son of Man rises from the dead, right? At least they got that disclaimer. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego might not have gotten any disclaimer. Yeah. Yeah. The other neat thing about this son of the gods, notice Nebuchadnezzar doesn't even imply that he has the power to command that person to walk out of the fire.
Oh.
He doesn't even address him. He only addresses Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Yeah.
So I wonder if he expected everybody else to still bow down to the statue.
I'm assuming this probably changed that ceremony quite a bit, but it doesn't say, so I don't know.
Because they didn't, and they were...
It does say the malicious intent of these people has been negated, right?
Yep.
The whole malicious intent. By the way, where they translated maliciously accused the Jews, the literal translation is were biting at the Jews. They were viciously biting at the Jews.
They didn't like it.
Okay. With that, let us close in prayer because we are over our time. Heavenly Father, we thank and praise you that you did send your angel, the Son of the gods, Jesus himself, to protect Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And I especially thank you, as we thank you, that he likewise is here with us, guiding us, protecting us, preventing us from being harmed by the eternal fires of hell. In his name we pray. Amen.
Amen.